Okay, I believe we are live. So, my workshop today is on how to have crucial conversations. My name's Phil Ershadi, and my qualifications are that I've been a math tutor for 21 years, and I have bungled so many critical conversations in my life. What I'm hoping today is I've managed to turn all the mistakes I've made into some kind of teachable moment, and I hope all of you do better with this topic than I did when I was trying to learn it. So, funny story about how I got involved, assigned to this workshop was my boss one day, early in the semester, asked me, "Hey, Phil, what do you think would be good topics for people to present on?" And I said, "You know what? I have had so much trouble in critical conversations that people might call difficult. I could use a lot of help on that." And he said, "Well, guess what, Phil? You're elected." And so here I am. I spent a couple months reading about this, and I have a better understanding about how I've been going wrong all of this time. And I want to present what I've learned. I will be keeping an eye on the chat as well. So if anyone has any questions at any point during this presentation, please ask it in the chat. I am perfectly willing to go off script or skip around in this presentation because I'm not attached to the order this comes in. And as I'm going to say a number of times during this presentation, having a dialogue is almost always better than having a monologue. The more involvement I can get from you folks, the better, because I want to hit the stuff that you're going to find more useful. Sound legit? Get the chat open, and let me move it over here. And I will make sure I check that periodically. All right. So a lot of people have a fairly defined idea about what constitutes a crucial conversation. It's like sometimes you got to talk to someone about a sensitive topic, and before you do it, like something happens in your body. You start getting nervous, or you start maybe feeling a little bit aggressive before having that conversation. I want to define a crucial conversation in three areas. Number one, you know ahead of time that you and this person you're going to have this conversation with don't necessarily agree. But maybe you've never addressed it before. And maybe you're getting a little nervous about how you're going to address it. And maybe you're worried about the other person responding badly. And if they respond badly, there's high stakes involved. Like if this blows up in your face, it could mess up things up for you and whoever you're with down the line. And in a way where you're worried about whether you're going to be able to resolve it or not. And the reason why these conversations are difficult is because there's a strong emotional load behind them. And you're just like worried about how you're going to address it and what's going to happen as a result. Now, we come in sometimes with the best of intentions when it comes to these conversations. But generally, we're more likely than not to bungle them up. So I want to categorize the most common errors in these conversations as either silence or violence, okay? And I don't mean these in the strict terms, but really more in general terms. I think of silence as connecting to the other person, but giving up the truth to do it. So, how many times have you tried to have an emotionally charged conversation with another person, but you end up like losing your voice midstream? Like the words just don't come out. You can't even make yourself talk at the right moment. Or maybe you end up broaching the subject and then you see something in the other person that makes you stop, and then you start backing off the subject and change the subject to something else, and you never quite address what you meant to. Or sometimes rather than sitting down and having a conversation about this topic, you just drop vague hints about your feelings about it and hope the other person picks up on it. Doesn't work so well. In fact, almost everybody I know who's tried to drop hints about a sensitive subject and not really sit down and have a conversation has left disappointed. Or maybe at some point you have told part of the truth, but you've concealed some other part of the truth that you don't think is going to be palatable. Like these are all socially acceptable ways that we've come up with to not confront a situation and to try to have a conversation without really divulging our whole truth. So that's what I mean when I say connection minus truth. You're engaging the other person, but you're giving up part of your truth to do it. Then we have the socially unacceptable stuff, which I call violence, which is truth minus connection. Almost everybody knows at least one person in their place of work or in their family saying, well, I'm brutally honest. Someone's got to say it. I'm the one who's bold enough to tell the truth. But when they say brutally honest, they usually mean things like calling names, pointing fingers, fault finding, talking over other people to give them no room to breathe, or just accusing the person who's trying to talk to them of the same thing they're being accused of. All that stuff is truth minus connection. And even if we go into a conversation intending not to do any of this stuff, we find ourselves doing it anyway. So, full disclosure, this is really actually kind of an embarrassing story, but I think I'm going to tell it anyway. I had a situation at work once where, I was trying to teach a student and another instructor cut into the middle of my session to try to correct me on the things I was trying to teach. And I did both of these actually. In the moment, I clammed up. I didn't even say anything and I just walked away. And then later on in the day, I found that coworker later and just like got up in their face, started pointing my finger and raising my voice and doing all of the things that are going to prevent me from being an effective coworker or even being a decent human being. I didn't intend to do any of that, but there was, though, that silence and violence part of me is definitely still present. And nobody at all, even with the best of intentions, is immune to any of this stuff. Even if you intend not to do it, it's easy to do. Check the chat here. Okay. Very good. So, why do we bungle them so bad, even if we come in with the best of intentions? But it turns out being human and trying to have crucial conversations is really, really hard because we think that we're in control of all of our emotions, all our feelings, all of our stories, all the things we carry around with us, but we're not. Human beings are not that smart. What we do more often is we react. We don't really think about why we reacted, but we tell ourselves a story to make it okay why we reacted that way. I'm sorry to say that it's almost impossible to overcome this without preparing for it. This is what human beings were wired to do. Number one, our biology forces us into that. The first thing that our body does when we start getting under stress is flood us with neurochemicals like adrenaline, which increases our heart rate, and cortisol, which makes us act as if we're under stress. All of that stuff shuts down the thinking side of our brain so that if you're not ready for that spike, you're going to be operating with half your brain tied behind your back. Well, no wonder it's hard. That's not your fault. You were born that way, but there are things we can do to overcome that. Number two, it's even worse if we feel like we've been taken aback or surprised by it. Like figuring out all of this stuff while we are being flooded with neurochemicals designed to make us stop thinking is just something we're awful at because we're trying to multitask as we go along. We're trying to get a handle on all these feelings and all these stories flooding our brain while trying to have this conversation. And trying to do both at once is almost impossible because, again, we're only human, not great at multitasking. Also, if you think about it, having difficult conversations is almost never taught in schools ever. Okay? We don't really have a subject in school we teach about how to do better at this stuff. And most of our models for conflict resolution are basically non-existent. Like, look no further than social media to see evidence of this. You don't ever really see dialogue. If you head to the internet, you see people talking at each other, not to each other. They're taking turns monologuing and imagining how nice it would be if somebody was trying to listen to them. But what I find is most people really don't. And so we get so little practice at what dialogue actually looks at like we're not that good at it. And so we default to silence or violence, but we don't look at the third option, that maybe there is something other than those two things that we can do. Guilty as charged, by the way. I'm 100% of like defaulting to one of those two without thinking about what else I could have done. It's something I want to get better at as well. So, knowing all of that stuff, knowing all of the obstacles that are stacked up against you and why having a crucial conversation without getting stuck in the silence or the violence is so hard, why try so hard to be good at it? Number one, it's always better for our brains if we try to learn how to do hard things. Like I always say, like in teaching math, the only transferable skill that's really good for most people is know what your brain's going to do when it's confronted with something difficult. And if you want to find something difficult, look no further than math. But it turns out having crucial conversations is also one of the things that knowing how to do it better is good for our brain health. Also, let's say you're in a position where you have to speak truth to somebody more powerful than you. It pays to be honest, but we also want to be honest in a way that's effective. And going into a situation where we have to speak truth to somebody who has power over us and could harm us if it comes across the wrong way, and knowing that we can address things in a way that's honest and effective, and knowing that we don't have to choose between them is empowering. That's something we can carry forward to the rest of our lives. Having a crucial conversation could prevent an accident. Even if they know something incorrect is happening, even if they know they're right, they still hesitate to jump in and say, well, I'm not going to say anything. It's someone else's problem. But what if you could prevent a mistake without it being a risk? What if we knew how to talk to somebody in a way that's effective that could not only prevent an accident, but preserve the other person's dignity as well? Could be good for your personal relationships. Everyone's going to argue in their family, but when we argue, it's best to argue fairly. We want to be able to set a tone that doesn't end in an outright shouting match and doesn't end with everybody like sulking off to their rooms and not speaking to each other for days. Also, knowing how to have a crucial conversation without hurting anybody is better for your health. You don't want to like being in a place where you're not allowed to speak the truth and you're punished for speaking the truth, and or maybe you're just unable to speak the truth in a way that's healthy, actually is bad for your nervous system and bad for your body. Effective resolution of conflicts is actually better for your health physically. Also, being able to have these conversations where you can have a dialogue rather than a one-sided monologue will help you know yourself better and get to know other people better. If you don't know how the way you behave is affecting others, other people could have the wrong idea about you, and you could have the wrong idea about them. Even though sometimes the truths that you hear are difficult to hear, sometimes they're also necessary. I'll check the chat again, make sure I didn't miss anything. All righty. Looks like we're clear in the chat there. All right. So before we start it, I want to do a reframe on the word confront. I went ahead and looked up this word on the internet, and the first definition of confront was to meet with hostile or argumentative intent. I don't think that's right at all, and I want to reframe it. I want to break down the word confront. Con actually means with or together. And front means face to face, as in facing forward. So I don't want us to think of confrontation as necessarily an argument. I want us to think of confrontation as an opportunity to look at the truth together and give the other person a chance to see eye to eye with us. Because if we go into this sort of conversation expecting an argument, probably it's going to go a lot worse because our brains are going to get flooded with cortisol and adrenaline. And as I said before, that ties half our brain behind our back. So if you come in flooded with neurochemicals, as we oftentimes are, we tend to think that we only have two choices in a matter: choose silence, say nothing, and suffer and have your truth forever be unknown. We like to justify that by saying, the other person doesn't want to hear it anyway. I may as well just stay quiet because it's just going to lead to more trouble. Or we could say something and say it as objectionably as we feel and blurt out whatever nasty things pop into our heads at any moment and make foes for life. You're saying, well, at least I'm brutally honest. Someone had to say it. Either one of those options shut down dialogue immediately, and that's why I call that the fool's choice. And the internet, in some senses, has trained us to blurt out whatever awful things are in our heads without regard for the other person's dignity. And then we ask for grace from other people, but we don't give any grace in return. That's definitely not a good thing to do. Or else the internet trains us to lurk. Just don't even make any comments, read other people's comments, disapprove silently, and then just ignore whatever you felt for the rest of the day. The worst of all is the option where we try to mix both and try saying something and saying nothing and communicate passive aggressively, where we're putting meaning into our conversation, but it's not really the meaning that's completely true. That's kind of a double whammy. We want to make sure that when we are going to communicate meaning, that it is shared meaning, not meaning that just means something to us, but meaning that means something to everybody involved. Having dialogues instead of monologues. And the first thing we have to look for is what we have in common rather than the things that separate us. It turns out if you ask people that are in a difficult situation together, ask them to make a list about what they value, about 80% of it or thereabouts is going to be exactly the same. And neither person's going to realize it because they keep trying to monologue instead of dialogue. So, what we have to do is figure out a way to construct shared meaning and mutual cause between ourselves and this person that we're going to have that crucial conversation with. Rather than trying to run the other person over, we need to figure out what meanings we have in common, not what meanings we don't. So I've got a 7-step checklist of how we can start to addressing this. Number 1, start with what you really want. Number 2, check yourself for danger signals and check the other person for danger signals. If you see those danger signals, try to move to make it safer for people to share meaning with each other rather than try to recite their opinions. Okay? While you're doing this, try to keep yourself safe from your own stories because it's those stories that are going to basically trigger you into jumping back into silence or violence. When you state your truth, though, make sure that you stick to the facts and not the stories. Give the other person as much room as you can to listen to speak their truth. And when you listen, don't just smile and nod. You want to really digest what the other person is saying. But also know that there's a point that comes in these conversations. If it goes completely out of control and everything goes south, you may have to walk away with it for a while. And it helps to know what your boundaries are and when it's time to walk away. All right, before I go any further, I'll check the chat again. Alrighty. So, again, before we get involved in a crucial conversation, We got to know what we're really after in having the conversation at all. And I bet you most of the time when you plan to have this sort of conversation, you don't plan to tell half truths. You don't plan to lie. You don't plan to raise your voice or lose your temper. But again, humans aren't very bright, and it happens. And it can feel really good to dodge a difficult topic or shoot somebody down when you're talking about that. Sometimes it even feels good physically, but then later on you're like, "Oh, why did I do that? That's not what I meant to do." And the reason why this happens is because our survival stress causes us to forget the higher purpose of what we really want when our neurochemicals are screaming through our brain. Again, those neurochemicals are basically chemicals that evolutionarily ensured that we survived genuine physical danger. Not so great when you're trying to have a difficult conversation. But I would say before having the conversation, what helped me was just have a seat, write about what we really want, independent of our need to win and independent of our need to avoid. What did I used to want before I got spiked with all these stress hormones? Give yourself time to come down from that. What I noticed, like in my situation at work that I described earlier, is that I had no idea what I really wanted from that situation. While I was getting in this coworker's face and shouting at them, I didn't really know where I was at. And it wasn't until a lot later when I came down from all of that and thought about it and I started writing about it. And what I really wanted was for me and my coworkers to have mutual respect for each other's abilities. And I wanted the students to know that they could trust us to teach a class reliably. And I made a major mistake in not communicating any of that to that coworker. Instead, I just straight went straight into shouting. It's something I'm not proud of. It's something I don't want to do anymore. Some of you have been in that same situation where you ended up reacting in a way you came to regret later. So I would say before you end up having that conversation, know where your heart really is and what higher purpose you really have. Be honest with yourself about it. Now, if you're feeling unsafe, it's not a good time to have that conversation. And sometimes, if we're not in touch with ourselves very well, as I was not in touch with myself during that conversation I was trying to have, it's going to go badly. Also, it helps to check the other person for signs that they're unsafe. Because if they're really unsafe, whatever you say is going to feel like a threat. So before you go in, check yourself for tension in your body, muscle pain, tightness, sometimes sweating, sometimes shaking in your body. If you've got any of that, you got to figure out a way to bring yourself down from that before you go in. Check your feelings also. You may have anger or maybe even feelings of humiliation or fear. And this is where emotional literacy comes in, because if you only know that you feel angry, there's a big part of the emotional experience that you haven't paid attention to yet. Hit pause for a second and try to figure out where you're really at. It could be that you're finding yourself tempted towards silence or violence. And so you might find yourself getting hunched over, or like find your throat gets really tight and you're unable to speak, or maybe your voice gets really loud. Maybe you find yourself pointing your finger at other people. Maybe they're pointing their fingers at you. Maybe they're all hunched in on themselves also. The thing is, like, if either person involved with this has one eye on their safety and one eye on their communication, they're going to find it a lot more difficult to confront things healthily. And if that's happening, you need to know that it's happening, because the more unsafe other people feel, the more curious you need to get with yourself and the more curious you need to get with the other person. because the problem is not always the words that you say, but the conditions under which you are saying those words. And I would say, as a further note, from an unsafety standpoint, check yourself for that before you go in, and check the other person later on during the conversation itself. Now, it turns out this is also important because the more you look at your own signs of unsafety, the less unsafe you feel. The more you ignore your signs of feeling unsafe, the more unsafe you end up feeling. And as I said, if your survival stress is lower and you feel safer, your brain doesn't flood you with so many chemicals and you're more able to communicate effectively. Another thing is that people will know that you're feeling unsafe before you've even said a word because they can read your behavior. They can read the tension in your body. They can see all of that, and that might trigger them into an unsafety response. And then if other people are feeling unsafe, that can trigger unsafety in you. So sometimes you end up trying to have that conversation and it just goes south immediately. And you can tell that people are feeling really, really unsafe the moment you open your mouth. What we first have to understand is that people might be carrying in a feeling of unsafety that has nothing to do with you, even though maybe you're okay, but maybe the other person isn't. So just because other people feel unsafe, that doesn't mean it's necessarily always your fault. You never can really know before having that conversation what people are carrying into the situation. Not only why you're having the dispute, but also why they may be feeling unsafe as you discuss it. So, a lot of the time that we pick up on other people's survival stress, but we don't always know what we're seeing. And even worse, we don't know how to change it. A lot of the time, if people are coming in with raised voices and pointed fingers, we're not really sure what to do. We immediately find ourselves lost, and we're not sure how we can make it safer for them to come down from that anger and confront the situation together. Sometimes the signs of survival stress are not always that obvious, but we kind of subconsciously know when it's happening. And even worse, sometimes we react to it without realizing that we've done it. So, some of the warning signs when this is happening is that when you find yourself just blurting stuff out, whatever the nervous system says, like that's coming through from a place that's not really in control of ourselves, but it's from something a lot more physical, that's a warning sign that there's some unsafety happening. We think we're in control of this, but again, human beings are not that smart. Now, if you find people trying to deflect or change the subject or point fingers at something else, again, that's a sign that they don't feel safe. So we want to, again, have a higher goal than just getting out of unsafety because there's a thing we want to accomplish when we try to come out of that unsafety. So you want to make sure if you're going to try to come out of the unsafety that you're not, there's two things you got to have before you do that. You have to make sure there's a mutual purpose to having this discussion. Of course, we always come into these discussions with our own causes, but if you want to make sure that you're going to find cooperation, there has to be a goal that fits both of you. You don't want to come into a conversation completely self-serving. People need to know that the two of you are on the same team. If they don't know that, they're going to be suspicious as to why you said anything, and they might suspect that you're trying to humiliate them or knock them down a peg or just trying to mommy them or daddy them. They're immediately going to shut down on you or maybe go to violence. You don't want that to happen, so you need to start by establishing that there's some kind of mutual purpose. But that a vague mutual purpose is not going to do the trick. You have to be as specific as possible about the mutual cause. So, for example, I messed up here because with the situation with my coworker, I didn't establish that mutual purpose. I just went with my own purpose of making sure that I looked tough and tried to look like I was in control when That was the last thing that was happening. I was completely out of control. Same thing with respect. Respect's kind of like oxygen, in that if you don't have respect, you notice it immediately. If you do have respect, you don't really think about it. And if you're primed to suspect the other person does not respect you at all, then the first thing you're going to do is go to try to protect yourself, either by running away or getting into a fight, or even worse, try to take revenge later rather than having an actual conversation about it. All of these things are really easy to do. It's not always completely your fault, but it's not something that serves the purpose of your relationship. So, one of the things that you can do if you want to try to make it safer is to do something that I call a do and don't statement. Now, I want to clarify that this is not apologizing or taking full accountability for the situation, because in reality, both you and the other person are involved in the situation, and maybe you didn't do anything necessarily wrong. So this is not an apology. I would say only apologize if you know you did something wrong. If you legitimately did something that you know was against your values, apologize then. But this is not necessarily an apology. What you want to do is, if you notice that somebody's reacting poorly to what you've said, you could say, it isn't my intention to do whatever thing you feel like triggered that. And remind the other person that you do have a mutual cause, that you two are in this together, and say, what I want to do is this thing that serves us both. Now, you have to be honest about this. You don't want to pretend like there's a mutual cause when there isn't really one. Because if you try to do that, the other person's going to know. They're going to realize that this person is just trying to flim flam me because they don't respect me. This person's in it for themselves. You don't want to be that person. You want to definitely have a mutual cause before you go in there and try to talk about this. Because if you don't, it's going to look like you're trying to control other people's behavior. And that actually is suspicious, and even worse, reflects a lack of respect or mutual purpose at all. You check the chat before we go on. So sometimes the problem is that we don't know what the mutual cause is. But if you have a conflict with somebody else, you can turn that conflict into a chance to look for a mutual cause. Just because you disagree does not mean it has to end that way. Maybe you can find something you can agree on. Number one, you want to commit to looking for that mutual cause together. You can even come out and say, listen, I know that maybe we disagree on things, but maybe there are things in this situation that we can agree on. This is a hard thing to say when you're confronted with somebody else's survival stress. But you can tell that other person that my goal is to find the areas in which we can agree. Now, maybe that person's feelings also recognize that there may be an unmet need behind them. Maybe they're carrying in a lack of feeling respected, or a lack of feeling part of anything before you even started the conversation. And maybe they're actually afraid to speak their truth. Maybe they're struggling. Maybe they're trying to do something that's really hard for them, and they're just afraid to say what's going on inside of them because it's embarrassing. Maybe they're angry at themselves. And that's really hard to admit, and even harder to say to somebody else. Now, if all of that's happening, if we can actually have a conversation about that unmet need, we can actually invent a new purpose other than butting heads that's independent of the argument itself. Say, well, I know we've disagreed on this, but since we agree on this other thing, maybe you and I can cooperate on that other thing. And if you do have an unmet need, I'm on your team. I recognize, I see and hear that something was missing that I didn't know about. And so what I'd like to do is help you with that. But be serious about this. Be willing to brainstorm with that other person to help them meet that unmet need. Like, I'll give you an example from work. I teach math, and almost everybody who I work with in math is very quick to say that they hate it, but they're very slow to say that math actually legitimately damaged their self concept about who they are and what they're worth, and that they're feeling shame and they're feeling like they've become less than what they really are. And so, my role as an instructor is to help me people meet that unmet need, even if they start clamming up and refuse to talk to me, or even if they lose their temper with math. But we all have the power to do these things. Now, again, even with the best of intentions, even if we intend to help the other person, we're going to have our own stories come up as we try to do that. And it's really easy to act in self destructive ways and then tell ourselves a story why it's okay that we just acted self destructively. Now, the reason why this happens is because sometimes we're aware of how we've acted, but we're not always aware of the feelings that precipitated that action. And even worse, even if we're aware of our feelings, sometimes we aren't aware of what story came before that feeling that fed into that feeling and flooded us with all these nasty neurochemicals. And even worse, we don't know why we're telling ourselves that story because we're not really sure what we saw in the other person that precipitated that story. Okay? All of these four things, sensing, telling the story, getting a feeling, and doing the action, happens in a split second. And human beings are not that smart. We don't understand that all of these things fed into it. Again, not your fault. The human brain was evolved to tell us stories, but it's not very accurate when it tries to tell them. Sometimes we sense something that is vaguely reminiscent of something that came before. And we tell ourselves a story, but not the way we would read a book or write a paper. Our brain like floods us with that story, 1,000 words a second. And it happens before we've even realized it's happened. And then we tell ourselves that story because we made a fuzzy match in what we sensed. That story has an emotional load associated with it. And then we act based on that emotional load. But that's not always good for us. Now, there are so many stories that we can tell ourselves, but I want to concentrate on three in particular that are the most clever ones. And I call these clever stories because they're usually a little bit true, but not completely true. Now, all of us have felt helpless in the past at some point, oftentimes when we were too small and too defenseless to change anything. We have to come into a crucial conversation remembering that we are adults. We're not as helpless as we used to be. And whatever was true in the past when we felt disempowered is not necessarily true now. The first true story goes some variation of, it's not my fault. And it's always true that some of the fault is not yours, but there's almost always a juncture where you could have chosen to do something differently. Like, for example, like with most situations that I've had in conflict, I've made the mistake of either not saying anything because I was afraid to, or losing my temper because I was afraid of being disempowered. I had 100 other choices rather than to do those things, but I didn't take them. But there, even if it's a choice that you don't see, it's important to recognize that there was definitely another choice. You could always point your finger at the other person and say, it ain't my fault because they started it. But that puts a double standard on the other person. You're basically asking for grace from the other person without giving them any grace in return. Pointing your finger at someone else is a form of name calling. You can say, oh man, They started it because they were a jerk. But that dehumanizes the other person. Once you've called somebody a name, suddenly it becomes a lot easier to blame them for everything because now you're not blaming a human being, you're blaming a jerk, some sort of adjective that you can tell yourself that's less than human. Now, this other one, I had no choice in the matter. There's nothing I could have said. But the thing is, every difficult conversation is a chance to change what's happening. And it's right to give other people the chance to change, just as you would like to have the chance to change if you've wronged somebody by accident. There is almost always a better option. Now, maybe sometimes in the past, you have had to deal with somebody who would not listen to you, but it's always better to give somebody the opportunity to change so that as they change, you have the opportunity to change with them. Sometimes it's also the refusal to make the choice to take action that's the problem. Because sometimes things don't get bad until you refuse to take action. So, to that end, I want to present a checklist. So, here are things that you want to be willing to check to tell yourself whether or not you've got a story going on like that. So, number one, look at your actions. What are you really doing? Did you just commit silence or violence against somebody else? Because if you're in the middle of a silence or violence response, trying to have a crucial conversation in the middle of that can overload you and just make you less effective at having that conversation in the first place. If you notice this in yourself, again, as I said before, hit pause, figure out where you're at, and figure out what you want. Now, also, if you've checked your behavior, check your feelings. Make sure that you have a rich vocabulary where emotional literacy is concerned. Again, if you think I'm mad, that's not always sufficient. You've always got other emotions like surprise or embarrassment or shame or disrespect or sometimes disgust going on underneath the surface emotions. You need to know what those are. Because if you come in feeling surprised by your feelings, you're going to have one eye on your feelings, one eye on the conversation. Not good for you. Now, once you notice those feelings, again, hit pause, figure out if maybe there's a story that's fueling those feelings. Recognize that the story you tell is not necessarily fact, no matter how convincing it is. You have to be willing to challenge what story you're telling yourself. Now, also check the facts of the situation. When you're recounting these events, make sure you're not getting stuck in a fictional story. It's easy to tell yourself, oh, that person's a jerk because they just acted like they run my classroom for me. Like, I have to admit, that's something that was a story I was telling. But it's better to concentrate on the literal events that happened without rushing to judgment as to why you think that story happened. And as I'm going to say later, when you have that conversation, it's always better to lead in with facts rather than a story. Make sure you know the difference between the things that happened and the story you're trying to tell yourself about it. So, to reframe the situation, it's easy to feel like you're the victim, but you have to reframe yourself as not a victim, but an empowered actor in the situation. Remember that you have the ability to change what's happening and to influence future events. When you feel that victim narrative in you, make sure that's not from a story that you carried into the situation. And maybe the action you took, whether silence or violence, didn't actually further your goal. Keep an eye on the higher goal, the mutual cause that you have with this other person, and think about, is there a way I could move toward that rather than silence or violence? Now, also, we want to reframe the other person not as a nefarious villain, but just an ordinary person. If you feel like they've done something wrong, maybe they don't realize it. Or maybe if they've overreacted, there might be a good reason or an unmet need that they're trying to fill. It's possible that it's a misunderstanding, and it's possible there's something they need and they're struggling, and maybe you have the power to help. You don't want to tell someone they're a villain story about somebody unless you really got the facts to match. Now, the situation can feel like it can't be changed, but remember there's a part of all of us that wants things to be better, even this other person that you feel is wronging you. So the things that happen right now don't have to continue to be that way. And again, you may have been disempowered in the past, but just because you were disempowered in the past doesn't always mean that that's how disempowered you are right now. You have to remember that just because you have felt disempowerment and you feel that shame at that disempowerment deep in your body doesn't necessarily mean that this difficult situation that you're in is still happening now. It may be that you are more empowered than you realize. All right. I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to skip forward a little bit. All right. So when you're having this conversation, I want to give you this acronym: state your truth. Share, tell, ask, talk, and encourage in this order. Okay. So when I say share, I don't mean share your stories yet. Okay. If you're trying to introduce a difficult topic to somebody, what you want to lead in with is the set of facts that you observed. You have to be willing to spend your judgment as to somebody's motives at this time. Don't lead in judging the other person, but just state observable reality. And you don't want to do this for reasons that are self serving, but because you and that other person's mutual cause are not being served by the thing that happened. Okay. At this point, you need to know that you are saying this because there is a higher purpose you and the other person could serve. As you share the facts, think about not your own story, but how an outside observer might see the situation if they were there. So don't get too stuck in your viewpoint yet. After you've shared the facts, you have to admit to yourself, yes, you do have a story. Admit that maybe you had a part in this situation too, though. The story you tell yourself, oftentimes, if it's a clever story, leaves out your role and concentrates on the other person's role. At this point, you can state what you think the other person's role is, but as you do this, you must also admit what your role in the situation was. Now, sometimes when we have these conversations, we will oftentimes do them for at least a little bit self serving reasons. It's not wrong to want to serve yourself because you have needs too, and you don't need to feel guilty about having those needs. So it's okay to admit that there's something you want from that. But rather, when you state that want, I want you to steer clear of the word should. Okay. I know it's a cliche at this point, but I'm serious about this. 90% of the shoulds that you have for other people or yourself don't need to be in your vocabulary. Maybe 10% of them are important. Most of them aren't as important as you think they are. Like scrub should from your vocabulary. You want to lead with, it's like, well, I will tell you can say, well, here's what it looks like to me, rather than saying, you better do this. If you tell anyone what they better do, the first thing they're going to do is not listen to you. But you don't want to get too caught up in telling this story. Yeah, and you have to be willing to change it. Okay. A is for ask. I want to emphasize A is not for attack. A is for ask. So other people's motives are kind of like the question mark boxes in Super Mario Brothers because you never know what's in them. Could be a power up, could be a coin, could be nothing. We don't know. We might have a story where we think we know what it is, but we have to admit that we don't. So you need to give the other person room to express where they're at. And you want to lead in with grace. Don't assume the other person is a villain. Presume that they're not guilty and whatever happened might be for reasons that you don't know. because you got two ears and one mouth for a reason. So after you've presented them with your awareness of what the situation is, stop and let them talk about how they experienced the situation. Again, there might be meaning behind their actions that you don't know about. And you're free to ask about what the meaning is behind the actions you've observed, but you don't want to ask about who they are as a person and don't attack their personality. Leave that alone completely. Your body might sometimes tell you during this that you need to interrupt and cut in and start monologuing in your point of view. That's not a good thing to do because the meaning that they add to this conversation is meant to be shared between you. And the meaning that you add when you tell your story is meant to be shared between you. Oh, got a message here. Oh, it's my boss. He is sending the link for the next session. I believe that's also the 5-minute warning. So I will get to the end of this section. Now, when we ask about that, be willing to talk about what you need, but remind them that their needs are also as important as yours. Not more important, not less important, but equally important. Because you're part of the group, your needs matter. They're part of the group too, their needs matter. And you want to find where those intersect. Now, when you tell people about your needs and what you see in the situation, you want to tell the whole truth. And when I say the whole truth, I don't want you to harp on just the negative, even though that's really tempting. You want to tell people what the positives are too. Now, be careful about false flattery. If you're trying to say a positive that you don't really believe, people are going to know. Okay. And it's going to feel manipulative, and that's going to shut the conversation down. You want to, even if you have needs, you want to address the group's needs because both of you are involved. And as you talk, say outright, like, here are the things I observed. Here's what I think is happening, but I don't know. Can you please help me understand what's going on? And when you ask for something, make sure that people know that they have a choice in what they're going to do next. Because if you come in with, you better, that's just manipulation. You're not going to trample the other person, monologue about what you need, and not take theirs into account. You're trying to reach an agreement, not an argument. And of course, E, meaning encourage. Again, be genuinely willing to listen to other people. Okay. You don't want to say things that will take away other people's agency or take away their option to talk about what they want to talk about. You don't want to deny them the opportunity to add shared meaning into the pool. Sometimes if people are really headed into silence or violence, you can ask more specific questions. Like, if the situation is reminiscent of something else that's happened before, you can ask, is this related to something that's happened in the past? All right. So, active listening. I have another workshop on this, but I'll just give you the Cliff Notes version of it. Active listening goes in 4 steps: ask, mirror, paraphrase, and prime. Remember, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. You want to start by asking people to express themselves. And then if people are having some sort of emotional response to things that have happened, let them know that you see them, let them know that you hear them, and don't fake it. Really be willing to listen about it. Also, once people have spoken, hit pause for a second, digest what you just heard, and try to say it back to them in your own words to make sure that the meaning that they've added, that they're trying to add to the pool, is the same as the meaning you're taking away from it. Because if you can agree on that, you're that much closer to coming to an overall agreement. And when I say prime, it's a good idea to ask more leading questions to encourage people to share more meaning. Because if you've listened and you've mirrored their experience back to them and you've digested what they've said, they're going to feel safer sharing more information because you've established mutual respect and mutual cause. All right. One more thing. So sometimes you're going to run into people who are going to refuse to speak their truth and instead are just going to try to insult you and hit you with so much silence or violence or both that it's almost impossible to have a conversation because they keep looping back to either insults or silence. You have to be realistic about this because you can't decide what other people do. You're really just not trying to even change their personality. You're trying to resolve one situation. Even if you do have judgments coming in about the other person, even if you don't even like them, you're only trying to solve one situation at a time. Also, before you approach the situation, know how much derailing of the conversation or difficult behavior you're willing to take. If you are at your limit, it's okay to say, listen, I'm not safe continuing this conversation right now, and I've got to step away at this moment. Now, if people start trying to point the finger at you, act more like a broken record. Just say, okay, I understand your concerns, but at this moment, I want to talk about this one topic, and I'm willing to address what you say I've done later on. Because right now, I feel like we need to resolve this because it's important to me. And sometimes you've got to do that several times in a row. If people start resorting to personal attacks and you are getting unsafe, just understand that you have the option to stop and come back at a later time, or even enlist help from other people who may have been affected by this in the past. All right. So anybody who wants to ask me questions, I will stay in the meeting a little bit longer. But if I had to sum all this up in one line, I would say that dialogue is better than monologue. If you're having a crucial conversation in monologue mode, it will be a lot less effective than if you choose to dialogue. That's all I have to present, everybody. Those of you who are going to go to another session, you are free to follow James's link. For those of you who want to stay, I am willing to stick around for a couple more minutes and answer any questions you have in the chat. So I'm going to open the chat just in case anyone wants to add anything or ask me anything about anything I've presented. For the rest of you, I hope you have learned something from this and you were able to take something useful away from this. I am going to upload the presentation for anybody who wants it. Go to how to have crucial conversations. Everybody, I'm glad you could make it. And there are the slides. You can download those and review anything that I've said. The video will be uploaded to YouTube here in a moment. All right. If that's all we got, I'm going to stop the recording.